Chapter 4. The Latin Master. 1. As his father had instructed, William had not mentioned the letter addressed to Abelard Greewolf to anyone. Following his trip to Avenfore Lake, he had spent a long evening trying to figure out how he would be able to arrange a visit to Mr. Greewolf, without having to explain why he needed to go to see him. As luck would have it, the very next day Aunt Edna announced that she planned to visit Mr. Greewolf, as he had promised her some flowers from his garden, and she wondered if Elsie and William would like to join her. Mr. Greewolf supplied Aunt Edna with some of the best seeds for her kitchen garden, Elsie explained to William. All three walked together to get the van from the garage next to Uncle Walter's shop. Aunt Edna popped inside for a moment to let Uncle Walter know where they were going, while William and Elsie waited outside. Elsie peered in the shop window and waved to her father, who waved back. William waved too, but as he did so, he saw something which made him start. The strange man in the grey gabardine was in the shop with his uncle. Panicked, William jerked to one side out of sight of the window, bumping into Elsie and making her trip. "What's got into you?" grumbled Elsie, getting her balance back. "Have you gone mad?" William tried to think up a quick answer and not look like an idiot in front of his cousin. After all, maybe the strange grey gabardined man was only a tourist. "We shouldn't be distracting your dad," was the best he could come up with. "Can't you see he's with a customer?" "Sure I can," retorted Elsie, "but there's no need to push, is there?" William was saved from any further argument by the arrival of Aunt Edna, who led the way to the garage. He hoped he had seen the last of the odd stranger. Truth be told, the man gave him the creeps. To get to Abelard Greewolf's house, they first took the Avenfore Lake Road, and once outside the village immediately took the first turning off to the right. William was eager to meet Mr. Greewolf. He was also very curious to know the contents of the letter his father had given him, which was safely stowed in his jacket pocket. As she drove, Aunt Edna chatted away as usual, and William was able to glean further information about Abelard Greewolf. As a boy, Abelard was a great friend of James Mulween, Aunt Edna explained, hardly pausing to take a breath. "That's Byron Mulween's father. They went to St. Elm's together. Abelard left the village after graduating, and traveled around Europe. He learned quite a few languages. He even spent 2 years in the monastery of San Millan de Uso, that's in Spain, where he studied restoration and conservation of old books. After that, he went to Rome, where he worked restoring books in the Vatican Library no less. Finally, before returning to Avenfore and taking up the post of Latin Master at St. Elm's, he spent 4 years teaching Latin at the University of Edinburgh." Aunt Edna slowed down almost to a halt as they reached the fork in the road that led down to Abelard's house. The track swung round to the left and ran almost to the foot of the mountain. A narrow lane off to the right took them to the house. Outside the house there was an inscription in Latin carved into the trunk of an old oak tree, Ut cementum feceris ita meets. William, who was good at Latin, translated it aloud, "As you sow, so shall you reap." "Is that what it means, William?" asked Elsie. But before he could reply, an odd man in green trousers and braces, a dark red shirt and Wellington boots suddenly appeared from the side of house. A luxurious mane of white hair trailed down his back in long wisps from under his green felt hat. William couldn't help thinking that Mr. Greewolf looked extremely like an extra-large version of an elf, or even a leprechaun. William stared. Mr. Greewolf was nothing like he'd imagined. Seeing him there, nobody would have taken him for a respected Latin teacher at a school like St. Elm's. Elsie had to give William a nudge to stop him gaping, and to get him out of the van. Aunt Edna greeted Mr. Greewolf with a cheery wave. "My dear Abelard," she said, "you haven't been to the village for some time, so I brought you some of that apple pie that I know you love." Mr. Greewolf held the pie up to his nose and breathed in the sweet aroma of baked apple and cloves. "How kind of you, Edna, you needn't have, but I do thank you," he said with a smile. "You're right, I don't go into the village much these days. I spend most of my time in the garden." You have to take advantage of the good weather and get things growing. As you can see, Aunt Edna continued, I've brought Elsie and William along. William is Arnold's son. Mr. Greewolf took off his hat, and with a mischievous twinkle in his eye he made a low bow to Elsie. Good day to you, Elsie. You've grown into such a pretty young lady since I last saw you. Elsie grinned. Thank you, Mr. Greewolf, she replied with a mock curtsy. It's a pleasure to see you again too. Turning to William, Abelard shook his hand. It's lovely to meet you, William. You must be tired of hearing how much you take after your father, but it's the truth. I'm delighted to meet you, Mr. Greewolf, replied William politely. But first, don't think my dad and I are so alike, not that I'd mind if we were, of course. William noticed that a somber, earnest look briefly crossed the Latin master's face. I expect we shall find out soon enough, he murmured. Then Aunt Edna explained that William was going to be living with them and studying at St. Elm's. Well done, William. I look forward to having you as a student. If you're as good as your father was, St. Elm's is just the place for you. Abelard Greewolf beamed, as he ushered them all round towards the back of the house towards the garden. Let's get started in the garden, shall we? He continued. It's such a lovely day it would be a shame to waste it. To William's surprise, he winked at him, speaking in a voice too low for Aunt Edna and Elsie to hear. I'm pleased you've come to visit me, William. Something tells me we have quite a lot to talk about. Mr. Greewolf handed Elsie some secateurs and Aunt Edna a basket so that they could pick all the flowers they liked, and off they went together happily. Once William was alone with Mr. Greewolf, he immediately produced the letter his father had given him from his pocket. Abelard took it without a word, and moved a few yards away to read it. William watched, intrigued, dying to know what the letter contained. As he read, Abelard Greewolf kept glancing towards the forest. Then he took out a cigarette lighter, and burnt the letter. William looked on helplessly. There was nothing he could do. The letter had been addressed to Mr. Greewolf, and he was free to do with it as he saw fit. But the episode only served to heighten his curiosity. What on earth could his father have written to make the Latin teacher destroy it? Carrying on as if nothing had happened, Mr. Greewolf sat down, pulled off his Wellington boots and put on his shoes. Come with me, William, he said. First want to show you something. The old wooden steps creaked beneath them, as William and Abelard Greewolf climbed the stairs to the very top of the house. The attic room was spacious with a single window that didn't let in enough light to reach right into all the corners. There were books and papers everywhere. They filled the shelves around the room to overflowing. They covered what appeared to be the only furniture, a table and 2 chairs, and even more were scattered in piles of varying heights and sizes across every inch of the floor. William had never seen so many books and papers together in his life. I suppose your aunt will have told you something about my hectic lifestyle. As you see, I've accumulated a lot during the course of my life. Once again, there was a mischievous twinkle in Mr. Greewolf's eye as he spoke. Maybe too much, and sooner or later I'll have to start getting rid of some of it. William could only nod his head in mute agreement. Mr. Greewolf now made his way towards the only other object in the room, a telescope mounted on a tripod pointing out the window towards the forest, and beckoned to William to follow him. William crossed to the window and peered out. The view from the window took in the pier at Ravenwood, and a bit of the castle. He could also see the cross on the church spire jutting up among the tall trees. Mr. Greewolf swung the telescope around 45 degrees to the right, took off his glasses and looked into the eyepiece. It took him a few minutes to focus it, then he turned and smiled at William in a conspiratorial way. There he is. Take a look for yourself, William. William carefully put his eye to the eyepiece, to make sure he didn't jog it. He had to focus it to his own eye, but what he finally saw caused him to step back in alarm. What the devil? Hidden among the bushes and wearing a crash helmet was the man in the grey gabardine, with a pair of binoculars trained on Mr. Greewolf's house. He calls himself Gregor Wattingro. Mr. Greewolf explained softly, but his real name is Jäger Kronbad. He's German and was a member of the SS. At the end of the war, he assumed a new identity, and now passes himself off as an antique dealer. He arrived here a week ago, and is staying at Ravenwood Castle. You're not what he came for at first. The person who sent him had other plans. But unfortunately, when he learnt you were coming, as did the whole county thanks unfortunately to dear Edna, he changed his plans. The teacher took out a hip flask and offered it to William. Tea with lemon balm and honey. I always carry it around with me in summer. A swig of tea does wonders after a bad shock. William shook his head. Thank you, but I don't feel like anything right now. Abelard gave him a kind look. Of course you are concerned, he continued. So would I if I was being followed, and especially not knowing why and to what purpose. The Latin master stood up and peered through the telescope, checking that Gregor was still there. All your questions will be answered in due time. But we can't talk here. Not now. All I can say for the moment is that the letter may well change many things in your life. We'll meet again in a few days' time, and things will be clearer. But not a word to anyone about this conversation. From now on we must tread cautiously. Keep your eyes peeled and keep away from Gregor. Whatever you do, don't talk to him or even approach him. Now he's sure who you are, he's more dangerous than ever. He's going to trail you everywhere, but don't worry. I'll sort things out soon enough. Mr. Greewolf picked up a dusty, rather tattered-looking leather-bound book from the top of a particularly tall pile of books close to the telescope. William watched in puzzlement as the Latin master pulled a pen out of his pocket and drew a quick sketch on the last page of the book before handing it to him. Thursday afternoon we'll meet at 3 o'clock at the old church. The area around the church has been made into a bird sanctuary. It's a protected area, and nobody goes there. You'll find it easily enough. The turnoff is a short distance before the water pump at Hollypoint. Keep going past the no entry sign at the edge of the forest, and you'll get to the church. I've sketched a map just in case. Now remember, you're to come alone and do everything you can to shake Gregor off. William cradled the book in his hand. You can count on me, Mr. Greewolf. I won't be followed, he said. He wished they could meet sooner so that he could learn what was going on, but he didn't think it would be wise to push the matter. Oh, and you can keep the book as a souvenir of our first meeting, Abelard Greewolf said, as he showed William downstairs and out into the garden where Aunt Edna and Elsie were tying the flowers they had collected into bunches. Thank you so much, Mr. Greewolf, the flowers are beautiful, Elsie exclaimed. Yes, thanks indeed, my dear Abelard, chirped Aunt Edna. You've been so kind. By the way, those amaranths are extraordinarily beautiful for the season. I don't know how you do it. Abelard Greewolf gave a broad grin and winked again at William. Well, Edna, he replied, you know me, an old druid has his secrets. 2. William couldn't sleep that night. For a long while, he sat by the window and looked at the night sky. It was one of those summer nights when the sky was ablaze with stars. Still restless despite the late hour, he picked up the tattered book Mr. Greewolf had given him and examined it more closely. The first thing that struck him was the faded gilt figure of a falcon on the front cover. It reminded him of the falcon carving on the Avenfore High Cross in the village square. Below it was the name of the publisher, NBS Press Avenfore. William had never heard of a publishing company in Avenfore before. On the inside page of the book was a color illustration, which showed a group of 12 knights in full armor standing at the top of a rocky outcrop. The knights were wearing white mantles with red crosses emblazoned across their chests, and their swords were raised in battle, each sword with a strange cross symbol like a cross with a shamrock leaf at the end of each arm. William immediately recognized them for what they were: Knights Templar, members of the famous order of warrior monks who had led the Crusades in the Middle Ages. William stared at the picture for some time, admiring its vibrant colors and the ferocity and grim determination on the faces of the 12 knights and Saladin's Mameluke warriors. Its title was as intriguing as the frontispiece, the Chronicle of the Noble Order of the Alliance. Pulling the bedsheets tightly around him, William settled in to read.